I probably hold the world record for the fastest a homeowner has ever gone from being accused of a felony to being handed control of an entire multi-million-dollar construction project. All because an HOA president with more ego than sense decided to pick a fight with a mountain. And when I say a mountain, I mean it literally. My property backed onto a massive, steep, and geologically grumpy slab of granite, and the only thing keeping it from reclaiming the entire neighborhood was my wall, the wall she had torn down. If you think your HOA is a nightmare, just wait. This story is completely insane. Drop me a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because you are not going to believe what happened next. It all started, as these things so often do, with a beige house. Specifically, my beige house. When my wife and I bought the property, we were ecstatic. It was the last house on a cul-de-sac, nestled into the base of a small mountain in a way that felt both secure and breathtaking. The previous owner, a retired civil engineer named Arthur, had spent a decade perfecting it. He was a man who understood the awesome and unforgiving power of nature. The defining feature of the property wasn't the house, but the wall. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a tiered retaining wall system constructed from massive, interlocking concrete blocks and reinforced with geothermal anchors drilled deep into the bedrock. It stood about 30 feet high at its tallest point and curved elegantly along the entire back of the property, holding back literally thousands of tons of earth and rock. Arthur had walked me through the blueprints, the geotechnical survey reports, and the county permits. He'd built it to withstand a once-in-a-thousand-years storm, he'd said with a proud glint in his eye. It was less of a backyard wall and more of a private fortress against gravity. That's what we bought. We didn't just buy a house. We bought a feat of structural engineering. And I, being a geotechnical engineer myself, appreciated it on a level that few others could. It was beautiful. It was safe. And it was ours. For the first 2 years, life was idyllic. We knew our immediate neighbors, a friendly retired couple on one side and a young family on the other. The HOA, which we'd been told was fairly hands-off, sent out the occasional newsletter about lawn maintenance and holiday decorations. It seemed benign. We paid our dues and lived our lives, enjoying our unique, fortified slice of suburbia. Then, Brenda happened. Brenda wasn't her real name, but it fit the archetype so perfectly I can't think of her as anything else. She was elected HOA president on a platform of community beautification and standards enforcement. This translated, as it often does, to making everyone's life miserable over things that don't matter. Brenda drove a gleaming white Cadillac Escalade that was always aggressively polished. And she had a particular way of looking at your property that made you feel like you'd personally offended her ancestors by planting petunias instead of begonias. Her reign of terror began subtly. A notice about a trash can left out an hour too long. A passive-aggressive comment about the shade of our welcome mat during a neighborhood walkthrough. We, like most, simply complied. It was easier than fighting. We were busy with our jobs, with our lives. But Brenda, fueled by these small victories, grew bolder. Her focus became an obsession, and her obsession became my wall. Her first official communication on the matter was a letter, printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock, that felt far too self-important for its contents. It stated that our unapproved industrial retaining structure was not in keeping with the aesthetic harmony of the community. It cited a vague bylaw about all backyard structures needing to be natural in appearance, like wood or stacked fieldstone. She demanded we submit a plan for its removal and replacement with a more appropriate structure. I almost laughed. I drafted a polite, professional reply. I explained the wall's critical function, attached a summary of the original geotechnical report, and highlighted the fact that the wall was not just approved by the county, but was a pre-existing, fully permitted structure that predated her presidency, and indeed, the formation of the current HOA board. I pointed out that a natural stacked stone wall of that height was a physical impossibility, and that a wooden wall would be an act of geological suicide. I explained, using small words, that without that specific engineered wall, the hillside would fail. I concluded by stating that we would not be submitting a plan for its removal as it was a non-negotiable safety feature. I thought that would be the end of it. I had applied logic and facts to the problem. I had, foolishly, assumed Brenda operated in the same reality I did. Her response came a week later. It was another letter, this one with a distinctly colder tone. She wrote that the board had reviewed my correspondence and found it unresponsive. She claimed their landscape consultant, a man whose primary qualification appeared to be his ability to plant geraniums in straight lines, had assured them a simple terraced garden with some railroad ties would be perfectly sufficient and visually pleasing. She informed me that if we did not submit a plan within 30 days, the HOA would have the non-compliant structure removed at our expense, per the powers vested in them by the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC rupees. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war, a particularly stupid, ill-advised war, but war nonetheless. I escalated my response accordingly. I had my lawyer draft a formal cease and desist letter. It reiterated all my previous points, but this time on expensive legal letterhead. It stated unequivocally that the wall was a permanent, essential fixture, and any attempt by the HOA or its agents to alter or remove it would be met with swift legal action for any and all resulting damages, including, but not limited to, catastrophic property destruction and potential loss of life. We sent it via certified mail, signature required. Brenda signed for it herself. The green receipt came back to my lawyer's office, a perfect little trophy of her acknowledgement. For a few months, things went quiet. I allowed myself to hope that the threat of having to deal with someone who actually understood the law had scared her off. The Escalade still glided through the neighborhood, a silent, white shark, but no more letters appeared in our mailbox. Life returned to a fragile normal. Then came the meeting. The annual HOA meeting was usually a sparsely attended affair, held in the clubhouse a few miles away. We usually didn't go, but a neighbor warned us. "Brenda's got something on the agenda about the hillside beautification project," he whispered over the fence. "Sounds like she's talking about your wall." My wife and I went. The room was half full of residents, most looking bored. Brenda stood at a podium, radiant with self-importance. She clicked through a PowerPoint presentation filled with pictures of manicured English gardens and quaint stone pathways. Then, a picture of my wall filled the screen, taken from an unflattering angle that made it look like a concrete monolith from a dystopian film. "This," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "is what currently greets our residents at the end of Oak Creek Court, an industrial eyesore, a concrete scar on our beautiful, natural landscape." She then unveiled her plan. It was the landscaper's railroad tie fantasy, a childish crayon drawing of what he thought could hold back a mountain. She announced that a generous portion of the HOA's reserve funds had been allocated to the project, and that a contractor had already been selected. She breezed past the legal hurdles, stating that the board had voted and their decision was final. She was ramming it through. When the floor was open for questions, I stood up. I introduced myself and my profession. Calmly and clearly, I laid out the facts. I spoke about soil mechanics, hydrostatic pressure, and slope stability analysis. I explained that the hill behind my house was not just dirt, but a complex geological formation. I warned them, in no uncertain terms, that removing the engineered retaining wall without a professionally designed replacement was not a beautification project, but an act of gross, premeditated negligence that would endanger homes and possibly lives. I looked around the room. A few people looked concerned. Most looked confused by the technical jargon. Brenda just smiled, a tight, condescending smile. "Thank you for your input," she said, as if I were a child showing her a mud pie. "But our certified landscape architect has assured us the plan is perfectly safe. The board has voted. The matter is closed." A few of her cronies on the board nodded vigorously. The motion passed. They were actually going to do it. After the meeting, as we were leaving, Brenda cornered me by the door. Her smile was gone, replaced by a venomous glare. "I don't know who you think you are," she hissed, her voice low. "But this is my community, and I will not have it ruined by your ugly concrete bunker. You should have just cooperated." That was the moment I knew logic would never win. I was no longer dealing with a person. I was dealing with a force of nature, in its own way as irrational and dangerous as the hillside she was so eager to unleash. And I knew then that I needed to prepare not for a debate, but for the inevitable, catastrophic fallout. My war had just begun. The next phase of my life became a meticulous exercise in documentation. I was no longer just a homeowner. I was a forensic engineer building a case. My home office transformed into a command center. I started by setting up a series of high-resolution, weatherproof cameras. One was mounted on a high gable of my roof, providing a panoramic, time-lapsed view of the entire backyard and the wall. Another was discreetly placed in a birdhouse, focused directly on the central section of the wall where any work would have to begin. A third, a trail cam, was strapped to a tree on the slope above the wall, giving me a top-down perspective. They recorded 24/7, archiving to a secure cloud server and a local RAID system. Every pixel was a potential nail in Brenda's coffin. I then sent another certified letter, this one addressed to every single member of the HOA board individually, as well as their so-called landscape architect and the contracting company Brenda had hired, a crew called Econoscapes, whose primary business seemed to be mowing lawns and trimming hedges. The letter was a final, formal notice of liability. It contained copies of my original engineer's report, a new summary I wrote titled, "An Analysis of Catastrophic Slope Failure Risks Associated with Unqualified Retaining Wall Removal," and a blunt warning that I was documenting everything and would hold each of them personally, jointly, and severally liable for all damages. I wanted to make sure that when the time came, none of them could feign ignorance. Meanwhile, I became the neighborhood's friendly, slightly eccentric geological expert. I started talking to my neighbors, not with panic, but with calm, factual concern. I showed them the original plans for the wall. I walked them through the basics of why a massive hill of dirt and rock stays put. To Dave and Sandy next door, whose patio was directly in the potential slide path, I gave them a copy of my liability notice to the HOA. "Just so you have it," I said. "I'm sure it'll be fine, but, you know," they started looking at Brenda's white Escalade with a new level of suspicion. I found out the name of the HOA's insurance carrier and sent a similar, politely worded package of information to their risk management department. I didn't make accusations. I simply presented facts and professional opinions. Insurance companies don't like predictable multi-million-dollar risks, especially ones they've been warned about in writing. I imagined my file being flagged with a bright red, "Warning, President may be an idiot" sticker. The contractor, Econoscapes, showed up a week later. It was a 3-man crew in a rusty pickup truck, towing a small, tired-looking bobcat. Their leader, a guy with a sunburn and a confused expression, knocked on my door. I was ready. I greeted him warmly, offered him a bottle of water, and walked him to the wall. "This is quite a structure," I said, patting one of the massive concrete blocks. "You guys certified for deconstruction of post-tension geosynthetically reinforced retaining systems?" He stared at me blankly. "We're just taking it down, man. Boss said it's an eyesore." I feigned concern. "Oh, absolutely. But you'll need the detensioning sequence for the tiebacks, of course. Arthur, the guy who built this, said if you cut them in the wrong order, the stress could transfer unevenly and cause a zipper failure in the upper tiers. The plans are filed with the county, if your engineer needs to review them." His eyes glazed over. "Our engineer?" he grunted. "Brenda said just knock it down and haul it off." "She said something about railroad ties." I nodded slowly, a picture of profound disappointment. "Brenda?" "Yes. Well, I formally notified your company of the specific risks. Just for your own safety, I'd get the demolition order and the engineering sign-off in writing from her. You know, for liability." The seed of doubt had been planted. The crew spent most of the day looking at the wall, making calls, and looking generally unhappy. They didn't touch it. The next morning, they were back, but this time Brenda was with them, her Escalade parked imperiously in the cul-de-sac. She marched into my backyard, the contractor trailing nervously behind her. My birdhouse camera captured the whole glorious exchange. "We are proceeding today," she announced, avoiding my eyes and addressing the wall itself. "My instructions are clear." I just smiled. "Great. Did you bring the revised engineering plans for the crew? And the waiver of liability for me to sign, indemnifying me from the consequences you've been repeatedly warned about?" Her face tightened. "We don't need your permission. This is HOA common area." "That's a fascinating interpretation of property law, Brenda," I said, "especially since the property line, as per the official county survey plat which I have right here, is a good 20 feet behind the wall. This is unequivocally my property. But please, don't let facts get in the way of a good story. However, since you and your team are here, I must formally state, for the record," I said, turning my gaze pointedly toward my birdhouse, "that you are trespassing, and that you are undertaking a hazardous activity on my property against my express written and verbal warnings. Any damage to my property or surrounding properties will be your sole responsibility." I then handed the crew leader another copy of the liability notice. "Just so you have your own," I said cheerfully. He took it like it was radioactive. Brenda, seeing her crew's hesitation, lost her composure. "Just do it," she shrieked at them. "I am the president. I am authorizing you. I will sign whatever you need." She scribbled her signature on the bottom of their work order with a flourish, a moment of pure, unadulterated hubris that my camera captured in beautiful 4K resolution. That signature was her confession. The crew, now armed with their authorization, reluctantly fired up the Bobcat. The work was agonizingly slow and amateurish. They had no idea what they were doing. They used the small bucket on the Bobcat to clumsily chip away at the mortar between the massive blocks, trying to pry them loose. It was like watching a woodpecker trying to take down a redwood. For 2 days, they made pathetic progress, managing to dislodge only a few blocks from the top tier. Every evening, I'd review the footage, catalog the sheer incompetence, and email a daily summary of the work, along with photos and video clips, to my lawyer and the HOA's insurer. My subject line was always the same: daily log, unauthorized and hazardous demolition, day X. I was building an airtight, chronological narrative of their folly. Then, on the third day, the rains came. It wasn't just a shower, it was a deluge. The kind of biblical, subtropical downpour that the National Weather Service gives dramatic names to. For 48 hours, the rain lashed down, turning the neighborhood streets into shallow rivers and the sky a bruised purple-gray. I wasn't worried about my house flooding. I was on a hill, after all. I was worried about something far more significant. The water was lubricating the very earth that Brenda had decided to destabilize. I sat in my home office, my camera feeds displayed across a large monitor like a scene from a disaster movie. I watched as the rain saturated the exposed soil where the contractors had removed the top course of the retaining wall. Water began to pour in behind the remaining structure, a structure whose integrity had been fatally compromised. On the second night of the storm, around 2 a.m., it happened. It didn't start with a roar, but with a deep, guttural groan from the earth itself. On my monitor, I saw the trail cam picture shudder. A small trickle of mud and rock slid down the exposed face. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric on a colossal scale, a section of the hillside gave way. It wasn't the entire mountain, not yet, but a significant slice, about 30 feet wide, slumped forward. It flowed like thick, muddy lava, overwhelming the partially deconstructed wall, shoving the huge concrete blocks forward as if they were children's toys. The slide bulldozed through my prized azaleas, crashed over the remnants of the wall, and continued its slow, inexorable march, fanning out across my backyard and spilling into Dave and Sandy's meticulously manicured lawn next door, stopping just shy of their patio. The sound was sickening. My wife and I rushed to the back windows. The scene was one of utter devastation. A river of mud, rocks, and uprooted trees filled our yard. My beautiful fortress-like wall was gone, buried under the very hill it was designed to hold back. My first call was not to 911. My first call was to my lawyer, waking him from a dead sleep. It happened, I said. The wall's gone. The slope failed. Activate the plan. My second action was to ensure my cameras were all still operational, and the footage was secure. It was. The evidence was pristine. Then, and only then, did I contemplate the chaos outside. Lights started flicking on in the houses around us. People were peering out their windows. Dave came out onto his back deck with a flashlight, his face a mask of horror as he saw the tide of mud creeping towards his home. And that's when the flashing blue and red lights appeared at the end of the cul-de-sac. 2 police cars and a fire truck. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they weren't here for a rescue mission. They were here for me. Because, of course, Brenda had called them. Her Escalade was already parked at the yellow tape the first responders were putting up. She was there, pointing dramatically towards my house, her face a mask of frantic, theatrical concern. A few minutes later, 2 police officers were at my door. They were young, stern, and clearly working from a script they'd just been fed. "Sir," the taller one began, "we've had a report of an unpermitted excavation at this address resulting in a landslide. We need to speak with you." Brenda hadn't just called the cops. She had accused me of causing the very disaster she had engineered. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it was almost impressive. I looked past the officers to where Brenda was standing, now talking to a local news camera that had just arrived. She was pointing, gesticulating, playing the role of the concerned public servant dealing with a reckless, irresponsible homeowner. She had created the crisis, and now she was casting herself as the hero. It was a masterpiece of suburban villainy. But what Brenda didn't know was that while she was busy performing for the cameras, I was about to bring the whole theater crashing down on top of her. "Of course, officers," I said, with a calm I didn't entirely feel. "Please, come in. I have a few things you absolutely need to see." The game was on. The officers stepped inside, their boots leaving muddy tracks on the welcome mat Brenda had once criticized. They had expressions that said they were dealing with a garden-variety lunatic who dug a hole he shouldn't have. "We need to secure the area, sir. And we need to see any permits you have for the work you are doing back there," the first officer said, his hand resting near his sidearm. I nodded. "I understand completely. However, I wasn't doing any work. The HOA was. Against my explicit, documented warnings. I led them not to my backyard, but to my office. On my large monitor, I had already queued up the highlights. Officers," I said, "before we go any further, I believe this will clarify the situation." I hit play. First, I showed them the time-lapsed video of the Econoscapes crew, bumbling with their bobcat, chipping away at the wall. I showed them the footage from the birdhouse camera, the crisp, clear 4K video of Brenda herself, yelling at the contractors and defiantly signing their work order. I paused the video and zoomed in on her signature. "That is Brenda Miller, the HOA president," I explained calmly. "And that is her authorizing the work on my private property, after being explicitly told not to." The officers leaned closer to the screen, their expressions shifting from sternness to confusion. "Next," I continued, "is a copy of the certified letter from my attorney, sent over 2 months ago, warning the entire HOA board of this exact outcome." I brought the document up on screen. The green signed receipt from Brenda, clearly visible. I showed them the geotechnical reports, the county permits for the original wall construction, the official survey plat showing my property lines. I had created a digital folder, neatly labeled Brenda's Folly, and I walked them through it, file by file. "And this," I said, opening a new folder, "is a log of every email I have sent to the HOA, their contractor, and their insurance company for the last 3 days, documenting the hazardous work in real time." I played the final video, the footage from the trail cam showing the moment the slope gave way. The groaning sound filled the quiet office, followed by the sickening slide of mud and rock. It was irrefutable. I wasn't the perpetrator. I was the Cassandra who had screamed the truth at a brick wall until it was buried under a mountain. The taller officer straightened up and looked at his partner. An entire unspoken conversation passed between them. He then turned back to me, his tone completely changed. "Sir, can you burn copies of all of this for us?" "Already done," I said, holding up a heavy-duty USB drive labeled Evidence. As they were preparing to leave, their radios crackled. The dispatcher's voice was tinny but clear. "Update on the Oak Creek landslide. The homeowner at number 12, that's the house next door, is reporting foundation cracking. The slide is still active." The situation had just escalated from property damage to imminent structural threat. The officers exchanged another look, this one filled with genuine alarm. They walked out of my office no longer viewing me as a suspect, but as the only sane person in a situation spiraling into chaos. I watched from my window as they approached Brenda, who was still holding court with the news crew. The conversation was brief. One of the officers took her by the arm and led her away from the cameras. Her expression shifted from righteous indignation to shocked disbelief. The theatrical mask fell away, replaced by the pale, slack-jawed face of someone who had just realized their bluff had been called in the most spectacular way possible. She was no longer the hero of the story. She was now the prime suspect in a criminal negligence investigation. The next few days were a blur of official activity. The city condemned the immediate area. My house, Dave and Sandy's next door, and the house on the other side were all evacuated. Yellow tape was everywhere. Geologists from the city and the state arrived, their faces grim as they surveyed the oozing, unstable mess. Brenda's beautification project had created a miniature, slow-motion disaster zone. The initial emergency stabilization estimate came in at $250,000, just to prevent the rest of the hill from coming down and taking 3 houses with it. The news story, which Brenda had hoped would feature her as a heroic community leader, instead showed clips of her arguing with the police, followed by an interview with me, where I calmly explained that the event was a predicted and preventable engineering failure. My lawyer released a carefully worded statement to the press, along with a few key documents from my evidence package. The narrative flipped overnight. Brenda went from community president to pariah. The HOA's phones, and those of its insurance carrier, began ringing off the hook. This was when the true genius of Arthur, the original builder, and my own meticulous preparations paid off. My evidence was unassailable. While Brenda and the HOA board were being deposed by teams of lawyers from the city, their own insurer, and my attorney, I was being consulted by the emergency engineering crews. I had the original blueprints, the soil analysis, the deep knowledge of what lay beneath that mud. I wasn't just a victim. I was the key to the solution. An emergency HOA meeting was called. It wasn't held in the quaint clubhouse but in a sterile conference room rented by a team of very expensive-looking lawyers who now represented the HOA's insurance company. The atmosphere was funereal. Brenda was there, but she was no longer at a podium. She was huddled in a corner with the other board members, all of them looking like they were about to be sick. They were being sued by the city for creating a public hazard, by their own insurance for gross negligence and material misrepresentation, by Dave and Sandy for damages, and, of course, by me. The lead insurance lawyer, a man with a gaze that could etch glass, stood up. He didn't mince words. He explained that due to the board's actions, which he described as reckless, in defiance of professional advice, and in direct contravention to warnings provided, the HOA's primary liability policy was likely void. They might cover the initial emergency cleanup to protect the public, he explained. But the long-term fix and the lawsuits? The HOA, and by extension every homeowner in it, was on the hook for that. The price tag for a full remediation, excavating the failed slope, removing the tons of debris, and constructing a new, properly engineered retaining wall, was estimated at between $1.5 and $2 million. A collective gasp went through the room. That amount would require a special assessment that would cost every single homeowner in the community upwards of $20,000. Panic set in. People were shouting, pointing fingers. The board members, including Brenda, just sat there, shrinking under the weight of the financial catastrophe they had unleashed. Then, my lawyer stood up. He let the chaos die down before he spoke. "There may be an alternative," he said, and the room went silent. He laid out our proposition. He explained that his client, me, was one of the few people who fully understood the scale of the problem. He explained that I had the original plans and the expertise to oversee the solution. Our offer was this: in exchange for a full settlement of my lawsuit, which included the complete, no-cost restoration of my property, significant damages for displacement and distress, and all my legal fees covered, I would agree to take over and manage the remediation project. I would work directly with the city and a reputable engineering firm, one of my choosing, to design and build the new wall, ensuring it was done correctly and, more importantly, cost-effectively. I wouldn't charge the HOA a management fee, saving them hundreds of thousands of dollars. My payment would be my restored home and the peace of mind of knowing the job was done right. It was an audacious proposal. I was offering to clean up their mess in exchange for total control and my own personal vindication. The insurance lawyer looked at me, then at my lawyer, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. He saw the elegant simplicity of it. We were offering them their only way out of total financial ruin. They would still have to pay, but with me managing it, the costs would be controlled, the work would be guaranteed, and they could avoid a drawn-out, multi-front legal battle that would bankrupt them. He turned to the shattered remains of the HOA board. "I suggest you take the deal," he said flatly. The vote was unanimous. Brenda didn't even raise her head. In the space of about 15 minutes, I'd gone from being the man she'd accused of a crime to the man in charge of a multi-million-dollar engineering project funded by her own catastrophic mistake. She had tried to tear down my wall, and in doing so had handed me the keys to her entire kingdom. The aftermath was swift and brutal, though not for me. The entire HOA board resigned in disgrace. Brenda and her husband put their house on the market a week later and sold it at a loss, desperate to escape the glares and muttered comments of the neighbors they had almost bankrupted. Her white Escalade, once a symbol of her authority, was last seen towing a U-Haul trailer out of the development, never to be seen again. My wife and I, meanwhile, moved into a comfortable rental home, the bill for which was sent directly to the HOA's shell-shocked new management company. The remediation project became my full-time job. I brought in a heavy-duty civil engineering firm I trusted, not some flimsy econoscapes. The initial phase involved removing thousands of tons of mud and debris. Massive excavators and dump trucks, the kind of machinery that dwarfed the little bobcat Brenda's crew had used, became a daily sight in our cul-de-sac. It was a monumental task. As they dug, the remains of my old wall were uncovered. The big, interlocking blocks were fractured and displaced, a testament to the forces that had been unleashed. But deeper down, they found the geothermal anchors that Arthur had installed, still drilled deep into the bedrock, holding fast even in failure. The old man had built it right. His design had fought to the very end. I didn't just rebuild the old wall, I redesigned it. Using modern soil nailing techniques and a state-of-the-art shotcrete facing, we designed a new wall system that was even stronger than the original. It was integrated into the hillside itself, becoming one with the geology it was meant to contain. It was a fortress, but an elegant one, with tiered terraces that we landscaped with native, deep-rooted plants that would further stabilize the soil. It was, in short, what should have been done from the start. I was on site every single day, overseeing every aspect, from the drilling of the new anchors to the specific mix of the concrete. The construction crews, who had heard the whole story, treated me with a kind of reverent respect. They called me the Mountain King. Dave and Sandy's patio was saved, their foundation was reinforced at the HOA's expense, and their lawn was resodded. I made sure they were made whole first. The community, once on the brink of financial collapse and civil war, began to heal. The new interim HOA board was comprised of sensible people, including Dave, who now understood the importance of listening to experts. The special assessment was still necessary, but because I had managed the project so tightly, it came in nearly $500,000 under the initial panicked estimate. It was still painful for the homeowners, but it was survivable. 9 months after the slide, our new wall was complete. Our backyard was re-landscaped, more beautiful and far more secure than it had ever been. We moved back into our house. The first night back, I stood on my deck and looked up at the magnificent curving structure that now protected us. It was a monument not just to sound engineering, but to the gratifying, karmic collapse of an arrogant bully. Brenda had wanted to destroy my concrete bunker because it was ugly. In its place now stood a $2 million testament to her own stupidity, paid for by the very community she claimed to be beautifying. The ultimate irony was that the new, tiered, and landscaped wall was widely considered to be a stunning aesthetic improvement for the entire neighborhood. She got her beautification project after all, just not in the way she'd imagined. Sometimes, people will tell you not to fight the HOA. They'll say it's easier to comply, to just paint your door the right shade of beige or take down your unapproved basketball hoop. And most of the time, they're probably right. But every now and then, you encounter a level of entitled ignorance, so profound, so dangerously stupid, that you have no choice but to fight back with overwhelming, meticulous, and professionally engineered force. You have to build a case as solid as bedrock, document every lie, and prepare for the moment their hubris causes the entire world to come crashing down around them. And if you're very, very lucky, they might just hand you the shovel to help them dig. Thanks for sticking with me through this crazy story. Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because you never know when the next suburban war is going to break out.